Welcome to this video on the Great Depression, from boom to breakpoint. We will examine the forces that shattered the American economy between 1929 and 1946, covering the theories behind the collapse, the human cost, policy experiments, and the challenging path to recovery. This program is brought to you by the Series of Thoughts team as part of the Economics Education series. On October 29, 1929, forever known as Black Tuesday, the New York Stock Exchange experienced a catastrophic single-day collapse. Roughly $14 billion of market value evaporated, shattering the illusion of endless prosperity and beginning the worst economic catastrophe the modern world had ever seen. What caused the collapse? It was a constellation of weaknesses and policy failures. We will explore key theories, including the credit boom and margin mania, income inequality, tariff wars, and the farm crisis and Dust Bowl, all contributing to a perfect storm. This speculative frenzy was fueled by margin mania. By 1929, 40% of stock purchases were on margin. When prices fell, margin calls accelerated the collapse. Concurrently, personal debt surged from $48 billion to $72 billion by 1929, outpacing wages and leading to widespread bank insolvency. Beneath the roaring 20s lay severe income inequality. While the top 1% saw income surge by 75%, the bottom 99% saw only a 9% increase. Furthermore, 80% of Americans had no savings cushion when the crash hit, meaning a single economic shock could collapse domestic demand entirely. Protectionist policies sparked devastating tariff wars. The Fordney-McCumber Act raised tariffs to 38%, which soured trade relations. Global retaliation followed, and U.S. exports collapsed from $5.2 billion to $1.7 billion. The Smoot-Hawley tariff worsened the situation, despite warnings from over 1,000 economists. European nations were burdened by war debt to the U.S., equivalent to $115 billion in 2024 dollars. Unable to service these debts, they cut purchases of American goods, leading to a contraction in U.S. export demand. This contributed to layoffs and farm price collapses even before the 1929 stock market crash. The agricultural sector experienced a decade of pain, starting long before the crash. Overproduction caused farm gate prices to fall by 2/3. Meanwhile, the average farm family income was substantially lower than urban households, leaving rural America with no financial cushion when the Depression hit. The Dust Bowl delivered a devastating environmental shock. High winds stripped 100,000 acres of topsoil daily. Over 500,000 families migrated westward, facing hostility. The Dust Bowl permanently destroyed farmland and deepened the economic crisis for the agricultural sector and labor markets. Towering walls of dust, sometimes reaching 8,000 feet high, swept across the southern plains. The Dust Bowl buried homes, killed livestock, and drove families from their land. It was a dual environmental and human tragedy that severely deepened the Depression's impact on rural America. The structural fault lines gave way in late 1929, resulting in the immediate economic shock. Banks collapsed, factories closed, and workers were left jobless. The subsequent suffering was unprecedented in American history. The stock market crash saw $14 billion in market value destroyed. The Dow Jones fell nearly 90% from peak to trough, the most devastating equity collapse in U.S. history. The market did not hit its bottom until July 1932, nearly 3 years after the initial crash. The banking catastrophe was relentless. Nearly 9,000 banks failed between 1930 and 1933. The cascade of failures, driven by panic, wiped out deposits and rendered approximately 12 million Americans destitute, with no federal deposit insurance to protect them. Unemployment peaked at 25% in 1933, leaving 12.8 million Americans jobless. Millions more were underemployed and wages were slashed. In some industrial cities, unemployment exceeded 50%, with African Americans and immigrants facing even higher rates due to systemic discrimination. Consumer spending plummeted by 50%, forcing small businesses to shutter. Industrial production fell by nearly half, leading to mass layoffs. This created a deflationary spiral, where falling prices deepened the crisis, trapping the economy and defying conventional solutions. The social fallout included the creation of Hoovervilles, shanty towns named mockingly after President Hoover, symbolizing government failure. Meanwhile, over 20,000 World War I veterans, the Bonus Army, marched on Washington in 1932. Their violent dispersal by Douglas MacArthur effectively ended Hoover's presidency. The song "Brother, Can You Spare a Dime" perfectly captured the despair of the Depression. Written by Yip Harburg and Jay Gorney, it sold 5 million records, becoming the defining anthem of a generation feeling betrayed by the system it once served. Hoovervilles became makeshift cities of the forgotten, persisting for years with their own social networks. These communities, lacking basic amenities, were a visible indictment of the Hoover administration's belief that private charity alone could manage the massive scale of human suffering. Chapter 3 covers Hoover's limited response. Although a celebrated humanitarian, his strong ideological convictions about limited government intervention often led to policies that deepened the crisis. His story highlights the limits of ideology when facing catastrophe. Hoover's philosophy centered on rugged individualism. He believed in a self-correcting economy and voluntary cooperation by businesses to maintain wages. He insisted relief should be handled by private charities, which were quickly overwhelmed as cities ran out of food. Hoover did take some concrete actions, establishing the Reconstruction Finance Corporation with $500 million for emergency loans to banks and railroads. He also authorized the construction of the Hoover Dam, a major public works project, though its scale was too limited and too late to mitigate the crisis. Several missteps deepened the crisis. Hoover's fiscal austerity and tax hikes in 1932 crushed consumer spending. His signing of the Smoot-Hawley tariff gutted U.S. exports. Finally, the forcible eviction of the Bonus Army in 1932 horrified the public, sealing his political fate. Chapter 4 introduces the New Deal, marking a new direction under Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1933. The New Deal was the most ambitious peacetime expansion of federal power, focused on the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform, fundamentally reshaping the government's role. Roosevelt's 1932 landslide victory was a clear mandate for change. Winning 57% of the popular vote and 42 of 48 states, his inaugural address famously declared, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." This shift in confidence was a critical turning point for the nation. The first 100 days focused on restoring confidence. Roosevelt declared a national, quote, bank holiday and passed the Emergency Banking Act. His first fireside chat reassured the public, leading to deposits flowing back into banks and a stunning restoration of trust. New Deal relief programs offered immediate aid. The FERA, directed by Harry Hopkins, delivered $500 million in direct federal cash relief to states. The highly popular Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, employed 3 million young men, paying them to work on conservation projects nationwide. Recovery programs aimed to boost production. The NRA set industry-wide wage and price codes. The PWA invested $4 billion in large-scale public works. The TVA brought electricity to rural areas, and the AAA paid farmers to reduce crops to raise prices. Reform programs introduced long-term safeguards. The FDIC guaranteed bank deposits, stopping bank runs immediately. The SEC regulated the stock market. Most notably, the Social Security Act created a permanent safety net with retirement pensions and unemployment insurance. The Civilian Conservation Corps was a national act of healing, putting young, desperate men to work restoring land damaged by the Dust Bowl and exploitation. For many, the CCC service provided purpose, discipline, and marked the moment America invested in their future. Economic debates surround the New Deal's effectiveness. The Keynesian view stresses deficit spending boosted demand. The monetarist critique argues the money supply collapse was the main problem. Revisionists highlight the 1937 recession's limits, revealing the complexity of the recovery. British economist John Maynard Keynes argued that during a severe recession, only government deficit spending could inject purchasing power, create jobs, and trigger a multiplier effect. Between 1933 and 1937, U.S. GDP grew by 30%, and unemployment fell from 25% to 14%, seemingly validating his theory. Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz argued that the Federal Reserve was the true villain, allowing the M2 money supply to contract by 30%. They asserted that monetary expansion, not fiscal stimulus, was the necessary cure. This monetarist view shaped policy, particularly the 2008 financial crisis response, when Ben Bernanke prevented a similar banking collapse. In 1937, Roosevelt tightened federal spending, and the Federal Reserve raised reserve requirements. This immediate relapse, known as the Roosevelt recession, saw unemployment surge back to 19%. This showed that premature austerity was catastrophic, reinforcing the synthesis that both fiscal stimulus and monetary expansion were necessary for sustained recovery. The Great Depression was not fully over when World War II began, with unemployment still at 14.6% in 1940. It was the massive demands of wartime mobilization that finally ended the Depression, providing a scale of stimulus the New Deal had never achieved. The chart shows that as federal defense outlays tripled from $13 billion in 1940 to $43 billion in 1944, unemployment collapsed. It dropped from 14.6% to a remarkable 1.2%. The war created 12 million military jobs and tens of millions more in defense industries, achieving full employment. The call for America to become the arsenal of democracy triggered staggering productive force. Steel output doubled, and American factories built hundreds of thousands of aircraft and tens of thousands of tanks. This production boom rebuilt middle-class purchasing power, validating the core insight of Keynesian economics. With 16 million men serving, 6 million women entered paid employment, celebrated by the, quote, Rosie the Riveter campaign. Furthermore, the threat of a major march led to the establishment of the Fair Employment Practices Committee, the first federal civil rights action since Reconstruction. The GI Bill provided returning veterans with tuition subsidies for college and vocational training, plus low-interest home mortgage guarantees. It sent millions of veterans to college and financed millions of home mortgages, generating $7 in economic activity for every dollar invested and creating the prosperous post-war middle class. The Rosie the Riveter campaign captured the nation's transformation. The demands of total war provided a collective purpose and productive capacity that the Depression had extinguished. The women who stepped into factory roles during the war permanently reshaped social expectations. The Great Depression was transformed into the institutional, legal, and social architecture of modern America. The institutions born in desperation became permanent foundations of economic security, and the lessons learned continue to shape global responses to financial crises. Enduring institutions like the FDIC, created in 1933, still protect trillions in deposits. Social Security now supports 65 million Americans. The SEC regulates capital markets, enforcing transparency to prevent the speculative excesses of the 1920s. Academic consensus now ranks the Depression's causes. Credit boom collapse and policy inaction were primary drivers. Smoot-Hawley tariffs and the farm crisis were secondary amplifiers. The critical finding is that early coordinated intervention could have significantly reduced the peak unemployment rate. The COVID-19 recession, though devastating, was technically over in 2 months due to coordinated fiscal and monetary intervention. The Great Depression's contraction lasted 43 months. The difference is the direct application of hard-won lessons from the 1930s crisis. To learn from history, we must understand the layered causes of the Depression. Recognize the human cost behind the statistics. Value and defend the institutions we built, like the FDIC and Social Security. Finally, act swiftly and coordinately when the next crisis arrives. The Great Depression revealed the fragility of unregulated markets and the transformative power of collective action. As FDR said, the true test of progress is providing enough for those who have too little. We built resilience from the ashes, and that wisdom is our most enduring gift.